Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the relationship between philanthropy and politics, organised by Alliance and sponsored by Mercer. My name's Andrew Milner. I'm a freelance writer and researcher, and I'm also Alliance's features editor, and I'll be in the chair for today's discussion. Our conversation also heralds Alliance's December edition, due out early next month, the special feature of which is on this topic. And we're very lucky to have with us today contributors to the issue among our panellists, including both of the guest editors for the feature. We've got coming up on our panel, we've got Jeff Kwasi, Klein and Sarah Durieux from the Multitudes Foundation, got Johanna Meyer from the Hertie School in Berlin, and we've got Henry Althaker from Stiftung Robert Bosch in Germany. Before we hear from our speakers, though, let me just say a brief word about the format for this event. We're going to run for an hour. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation, and then we'll open it up to a question and answer session, which we invite all of you to take part in. But do go ahead and say hello in our chat, which you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. And that's also where later we'll be taking questions from the audience. So make sure you get yours in there and or upvote others. You should be able to see that on the slide now on your screens. We'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the webinar and selecting questions to put to the panelists during the Q&A. When you ask a question, please do tell us who you are and where you're from. Time's obviously limited, we've only got an hour, but we'll put as many of them as we can to our panel. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the handle @AllianceMag and the hashtag Politics and Philanthropy, as you can see on the bottom of your screen. When the issue comes out early in December, next week or so, to read it, you'll need to subscribe. If you're interested in doing this, Alliance is currently running a joint subscription with Nonprofit Quarterly. You can subscribe to both magazines and save $49 on the total price. I've got no idea what that is in euros. To do that, you can scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the chat to learn more. I should say this offer is sort of time limited as it ends in the next 2 days. So if you're interested, don't leave it too long. Okay, so to today's proceedings. There's a long-running debate about the relationship between philanthropy and politics. Traditional received wisdom is that philanthropists should steer clear of politics, but there's a growing view that the two are actually inseparable and that philanthropy both can and should take a political position. This is becoming more marked as the political arena becomes more polarized, and it happens at both ends of the political spectrum, with left and right-leaning funders supporting not only campaigns by politicians, but also funding opinion formers who adopt the same views. Amid this kind of growing clamour over philanthropy and its role in politics and the contrasting political views of those who are firmly committed to supporting their own political agendas, there are also voices raised to point out that through philanthropy, public and accountable forces are exerting an undue influence on public decision-making. So, what form should the relationship take and where should the limits lie? How far and in what direction is it legitimate for philanthropy to support political initiatives? Are we actually seeing a sea change in the relationship between the two, with philanthropy taking a more acknowledged and significant part in supporting political campaigns, moving, as it were, from walk-on parts to being serious actors? In this webinar, we're going to try and explore at least some of these questions. So, well, you've heard enough from me now. Let me now bring in our first panelists. They're making a joint presentation, I understand, and it's Sarah Durieux and Jeff Kwasi Klein from Multitudes Foundation. Let me introduce them both together. Both of them are co-directors of Multitudes Foundation, a European foundation supporting political change makers working to make politics more inclusive, hopeful and human. In Sarah's case, before joining Multitudes, she launched and led the 13 million members mobilization platform Change.org in France and helped millions of French people to change laws, business practices and grow movements that changed the conversation in the country. She also co-founded La Rencontre des Justices, a movement building shared purpose between activists and social entrepreneurs, and Quartier Général, a collective for activists running for elections. She trains and supports change makers on organizing mobilization and narratives, encouraging them to use their deeply held values to build collective power. Jeff Kwasi Klein, also co-director of Multitudes. Before joining Multitudes, he led the May Ayim fund at Each One Teach One EOTO, a Black-led community-based education and empowerment organization providing financial and ideational support for the empowerment work of Black activists, initiatives and organizations in Germany. Prior to this, he led Germany's first anti-discrimination counselling centre for Black, African and African diasporic people at IOTA. He's a member of the Berlin Senate's Advisory Committee, Equality in Black, and a board member of Migrationsrat Berlin e.V., where he advocates for the rights and interests of Black and POC communities, as well as a variety of post-migrant self-organisations. He's a former party official of Germany's Green Party and was a candidate for the Berlin State Parliament in 2021. Jeff and Sarah, I don't know how you're going to organise this, but do come in and tell us about your work.
Yes, I will take this on. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon also to everyone who is joined in. Yes, my name is Kwasi Klein, co-director of Multitudes Foundation. I'm very happy to discuss this important topic, this important nexus between politics and philanthropy. As Andrew just mentioned, we've had the pleasure of guest editing this upcoming edition of Alliance magazine. And it's immensely important. And I say this because there is ample need to reconcile the widespread hesitation within philanthropy to fund political work and to actually realize philanthropy's role and also the responsibility in helping to shape democracies for the future. And on that, and also a democracy that can deliver on its promise of actually being representative, a democracy that is also responsive to the needs and the desires of the people living in the society. And this is also important with growing threat from the far right, also a democracy that is resilient against any attempt to dismantle it. And this reckoning with philanthropy's role in ensuring that democracy functions, maybe as advertised or even better, this is one of the reasons why we set up Multitudes Foundation. And I want to tell you a little bit about our work. We are committed to identifying political change makers across Europe and nurturing their efforts to reimagine politics. And our goal in this is to foster a political landscape that is truly inclusive, human, and hopeful. We're doing this by empowering these political change makers and providing them with resources, financial resources, strategic advice, or practical trainings. But beyond that, we also create a community of practice, which is a network where ideas can freely flow, where experiences can be shared, and where the members enrich each other in their mission and in their vision to reimagine politics. Our scope of what we fund is broad, but at the same time very focused. We support initiatives that prepare new leaders to run for office, new leaders coming from underrepresented communities that are fully equipped with the skills and the knowledge that they need in order to be successful. We also work with initiatives that cultivate more inclusive and human political cultures, for example, working directly with political parties, and also initiatives that are finding ways for people and communities to mobilize and to actually build political power. We invest in this mission because a democracy that truly serves everyone is a democracy that also includes everyone. Because when political representation falls short, and this is something that we've seen in history throughout, but also we're seeing this right now, when political representation falls short, trust in institutions diminishes, and pressing challenges cannot be addressed. Pressing challenges like the climate change, rising inequalities, and so on. So our hope and our belief is that through supporting these political change makers, we can actually turn the tide on this. People associated with Multitudes, these are our grantees, our grant-making council, local connectors, all the people that we work with across Europe to really understand what is going on in each local context. And also the many people who are in our community of practice, they are all dedicated to building a democracy that really and genuinely works for everyone. We've just had a workshop in Berlin last week where we brought together people who are political change makers from different sectors working together and thinking about how representation, actually what representation really looks like in a political setting, but also thinking about how we can dismantle some of the barriers to it. And irrespective of the background. So the idea, of course, is that a democracy works for everyone, irrespective of the backgrounds, who they are, what they believe in, or who they love. And to this, we really need to prioritize the perspectives and knowledge of those that are most impacted by a lack of political representation, and ensuring that their voices are heard. And if we want a democracy that works for everyone, we need, on the one hand, grassroots efforts that mobilize and empower people, but on the other hand, we also need inclusive political leadership and decision-making, because it is inclusion, this framework of inclusion, that provides a general framework for how we can structure change and how we can actually change political cultures as well at the same time. I will close now, but maybe one last thing that I want to say is that we can only succeed in this with a joint effort. So joining forces, building community, and this is exactly where the outstanding role of philanthropy also comes into play. These efforts by the political change makers, by the ecosystem of democratic renewal, they warrant support. They need our support. And it is on us as funders to deliver on this and to help to create a future where politics can actually be more than just a power game, but can actually be meaningful in how it can affect people's life positively. I will close with this and pass on to Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks for inviting us, and really excited to be with you all and see you're all committed to doing a little bit of the reflection around what politics needs to do and how philanthropy can help it to change. I think when we worked on the issue and with the Alliance team, one of the things we really wanted to touch on was what is actually political philanthropy. I think we have some, preconceived idea of what can be political philanthropy, and what we're really trying to do with Multitude is to say, the same way, there's a whole field for social innovation, there is a whole field for political innovation. And especially when we talk about democracy, we need to invest that field as philanthropists, as activists, as actors that are committed for a better future for all. So one of the things that was really interesting when we started talking about the project of Multitude and the reason for setting it up was that very few philanthropic actors actually invest in that field. And so we wanted to also set up Multitude's Foundation to engage the conversation on why is that and what can we do for more philanthropic actors to engage, but also do it in a very open and inclusive way, as Jeff has mentioned, but with clear values that we can help promote. And one of these values being democratic, the value of democracy and the value in inclusion in making democracy function. So the question we really asked ourselves as we set up Multitude, but also writing this issue was like, what are we afraid of? Why haven't we yet put money into building the infrastructure for great politics? We've, as philanthropists, put money into infrastructure for great education. We put money in infrastructure for, a good health system, or, cultural creation, for example. So why can't we do the same to have a functioning democracy and ecosystem? For us, it's really possible to do that and to invest in political work that's really going to reshape the way politics function. And I want to give a few examples of the projects that we fund so you understand what we mean by both political innovation and the idea of inclusion in politics. One of the examples is that we fund initiatives that work to help to have a better representation of different social backgrounds in politics, and especially how political parties can tackle this question. A few political parties have been good at including a vast diversity of representation when it comes to social background, but not all. So this initiative that is in France, it's called Démocratiser la politique, so democratize politics, works to both research and document and also mobilize people who are from the social backgrounds to really engage in the political work and also engage with political parties. There's a lot of examples like this where we can have initiatives that contribute to the functioning of democracy and make them basically fit for future. So Multitude Foundation, really, we're trying to show that there's a different way to do political philanthropy that is not only, focusing on one specific party or one specific candidate, but is actually making the political ecosystem function well. We think it's actually a very, very big responsibility for funders and for philanthropists to invest that field, and that it's really time to take care of our politics. I think we are all aware with what's going on, especially in the past few weeks, of the national and international challenges that we are up against in Europe, but also across the world, and that we cannot risk those challenges to become even bigger if we don't engage in the question of democracy and politics, especially. I think that for a lot of philanthropists, and this is one of our founder, Daniel Sachs, who's also contributing to our work, who says that, that democracy has allowed a lot of, social business to flourish, and that as, even entrepreneurs, we need, to give back to this system that has provided the economic development and the prosperity for future generations to strive. So there's this big responsibility. And there's also this urgency, and I think we really try to push that also in the editorial piece that you will be able to read in the issue, is that we need to respond now in the ways in which politics across Europe is failing us, and that it is a long-term effort, but that doesn't make it less urgent. Of course, we won't see change overnight, and I think that's really one of the things where we can do philanthropy differently, is like we basically invest for the future. But if we don't invest now in making politics more inclusive, more hopeful, and more human, we're going to face even larger challenges than the ones we are facing now. So I will just close and pass it to, I don't know how I have to pass it to, I will pass it back to you, Andrew, but just really, we hope that what you will see in the issue of this Alliance magazine is that there's a really wide range of initiatives that we can invest in when it comes to democracy and politics, and that it is very important to do so, and that we are willing to work with you if you're interested and discover what are the different initiatives you can fund, but also how you can engage, as Jeff said, at a very local level to make really politics inclusive and for all.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah and Jeff. So absorbed in what you were saying that I forgot I was part of the discussion. Just let me ask you this. I mean, you talked about the word fear in respect to philanthropists and getting involved in politics. What do you think is the root of that? Is it just that philanthropy is being kind of over scrupulous about not involving itself in the sort of in what it sees as not its business, or is it just a sort of long kind of internalized process that the two spheres should be different? In some ways, they seem kind of related. They're both after, in some respects, the public good. So why aren't they more integrated in some ways? But I mean, I'm asking you to that, but it's also a question for the other panelists too to think about.
I can try to give an answer now, and maybe other
panelists. Yeah, do by all means.
I think that there are two things. One, and I think you have some article in the issue that touch to that, is that sometimes philanthropy and politics haven't worked well together because it hasn't been transparent and it hasn't been clear for people how the money used by philanthropists what it was used for. So I think there's something about transparency. But for me, the bigger question is how do we sit with the idea of neutrality? And how do we sit with the idea that basically democracy would be kind of functioning by itself and trying to interfere in it would be a negative thing? I think we can all agree that right now there are some interferences and there are some money, there is some funds that are invested in trying to orient the way our society functions and the way democracy functions. So for me, the fear is coming from a fear of leaving a position of neutrality, which is not really one, to be fair. I think we need to engage and we can be very clear about the values that we are trying to defend, and that's what we do with Multitudes Foundation. We're nonpartisan, but we are value-led, so we know the kind of democracy that we want to build. That's a democracy that is inclusive, where democracy actually serves everyone, and that means that it answers the big pressing challenges, and it takes the perspective of all people who are involved in society. So I think to answer your question, the reason why we've been afraid is that we need to ask ourselves, what is this, neutrality that we are trying to uphold, and does it really exist, and can we challenge it?
Right, thank you very much. Jeff, I'll come back to you on that if I may at some point, but just let me move on to the next panelist for now, then we can sort of make a bit of progress. Our next speaker is Johanna Meyer. Johanna is a renowned organization strategy and leadership professor at the Hertie School in Berlin. She's a leading authority in social innovation with research published in top academic journals. As the academic editor of the Stanford Social Innovation Review and co-director of the Global Innovation for Impact Lab, she plays a pivotal role in shaping the discourse around social innovation. She advises companies and governments on social innovation and has been recognized with numerous awards, including being named a faculty pioneer by the Aspen Institute. Johanna, welcome. Come on, just Do tell us about your idea about making, for instance, democracy future fit. What does it you mean by that?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the kind invitation. I'm delighted to contribute to the discussion here today on the relationship between politics and philanthropy. Also then with an article co-authored with Sebastian Mena and Melissa Ötschelig from the Hertie School. Now, coming back to your question on democracy, making democracy future fit. This is actually at the core of our research, where we follow the emergence of political innovation, understood as a newly formed field of practice that makes politics and political change the objective of innovation. And this is where we believe this is also an opportunity space for philanthropy, but that also puts up some question marks for philanthropies to address. And I will come back to that in a second. So what was exciting for us was to see that these political change makers, as Jeff and Sarah referred to them, or these innovative initiatives, such as themselves, Join Politics, Brand New Bundestag in Europe, KSEP in the United States, Fixed Politics in Nigeria. We have colleagues here on the webinar from Canada, number of initiatives there. They cover a broad pro-democratic political spectrum. Some support progressive social policy making, others promote the interests of underrepresented communities. But what they have in common, and what is at the core of political innovation, is that they diagnose problems in the political system and collectively work towards solutions. Importantly here, these solutions do not only reimagine politics, but proactively change how we practice democracy and instigate thereby reform and transformation in the democratic infrastructure. Political innovation as a practice encourages us to think about social change and political change as interrelated and not as decoupled. And for me, as the academic editor of Stanford Social Innovation Review, this was certainly a welcome opportunity to pay attention to the political side of social innovation. As we all know, innovation never emerges in a vacuum. And therefore, we find it useful to talk about social innovation also as a field of practice. Think of a field as an ecosystem or a community, where different players have different and often distinct roles. Now, what I'm going to say now are stylized roles, and there are players such as Multitudes Foundation that actually assume all of these roles. Orchestrators, for example. Multitudes Foundation builds a community around more inclusive, human, and hopeful politics in Europe. Innovators, such as, for example, Jana Degroot, the founder of We Belong in Luxembourg, develop and introduce solutions to problems that the solutions correspond to democratic principles again. And then the enablers that provide support in the form of financial resources or engage in additional field-building activities. The Bosch Foundation here today, Obama Foundation, OSF, Landecker Foundation, Innovation and Politics Institute, number of others. Now, the topic of the webinar is to rethink the relationship between philanthropy and politics. And I'm convinced that the rise of political innovation represents a unique opportunity here for that. Because as we know, the relationship between philanthropy and political change is a complicated one, and it remains contested. We also know that philanthropic funding to support democracy work is clearly rising. Only in the US, we have seen numbers rising, 5.7 billion since 2011 spent to strengthen US democracy. Now, we don't always have to reinvent everything. So 3 strategies used by the number of foundations that have been strengthening, protecting democracy for decades are, of course, also viable options for supporting political innovation. Supporting, for example, the creation and capacity building of innovative projects for democracy. that strengthen the links and networks between innovators and enablers. Also here, the Bosch Foundation today here, but also the Ford Foundation have been doing this for a long time. Second, the practice of supporting individual innovators through knowledge transfer or training. Think about the Obama Foundation program. Landecker Foundation has a beautiful program. They are still relevant. And third, philanthropists developing their own democracy strengthening project. The Hewlett Foundation, the OSF, for example, are examples. However, the rise of political innovation not only amplifies funding opportunities for philanthropy, it also requires us to reflect on the very principles and practices for grant making, targeting political change. And you briefly touched upon that, Andrew and Sarah, already. So for me, one way to reimagine philanthropy in the context of political change is to use the image of zero problem philanthropy. My Stanford PAX colleague, Christian Selos, has recently used this term to allude to the responsibility of philanthropy to create healthy contexts that prevent problems from arising. The analogy here is medicine 3.0 that tries to prevent diseases. Healthy democracies are healthy contexts that enable social, economic, and political progress. Reimagining philanthropy in this way also then requires us to reflect on the prevalent practices we have to fund social innovation. Let me just allude to three aspects where we actually need to constructively revisit our practices. First, how we support political innovation. I believe philanthropists must move beyond mere performance-based funding. Linear logic models are hardly applicable when the ambition and desirable impact is to create healthy democracy. Second, creating a healthy democracy requires advocacy work and new tools to combine elements from social innovation and movement building. And third, philanthropies also must revisit their portfolio strategies to support political innovation. In order to create healthy contexts, healthy democracies, we need a repertoire and a combination of institutionalized political action and non-institutionalized political action. As Sarah already mentioned, there's a lot at stake. Political innovation must, and this is what also Jeff mentioned, it must be an ongoing and a collective effort to ensure the democracy remains an effective and suitable operating system for social order and progress. This requires all of us to revisit the division of labor and the way we operate. This, by the way, also applies to us researchers. We have stepped outside of our comfortable ivory tower and operate in political innovation as learning partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I was particularly struck also in your article about the point you made about the need to sort of have a different or abandon the sort of the traditional ways grant makers have of measuring effectiveness. I mean, could you just elaborate on that for a second? Do you have a sort of an alternative notion in mind, or is it something that just needs to be explored?
Yeah, Andrew, we have known for a long time that the way we evaluate or assess advocacy work has to be very different how we evaluate and assess classical social innovation intervention that address a problem, a technical problem, but then have also a clear way of imagining what is the output and the outcome potentially impact. So political work, advocacy work is far less linear, and also the attribution, Andrew, the attribution of who actually was triggering this particular impact is very hard to do. And this goes back to what I emphasized, what Jeff emphasized, what Sarah emphasized. This has to be a collective effort. And therefore, that collectiveness has to also show up in the toolkit that we assume or adopt to measure progress?
Great, thank you very much. Well, obviously we'll come back to you in the questions. Just let me move on to our final panelist, who is Henry Althaker. In his role as Senior Vice President at Bosch, Henry Althaker has headed the Strategic Partnerships and Robert Bosch Academy departments since January 2020. This includes the Foundation's programs addressing political decision makers, its think tank partnerships, and the Robert Bosch Academy, as said. As such, the department contributes to the Foundation's activities in all its thematic areas. Before joining the Foundation in 2013, Henry headed the Parliamentary Office of the German Minister of Justice, Sabine Leutheusser-Schnarrenberger. Today's webinar is putting a big tax on my ability to pronounce non-English languages, so I'm hoping I'm getting these pronunciations more or less right. He served as political officer at the Canadian Embassy in Berlin and worked for the international NGO Humanity in Action on Human and Minority Rights. His expertise includes migration and integration, German politics, as well as European and transatlantic affairs. He's an alumnus of several German foundations, including the German National Academic Foundation. Henry, welcome. Do come and tell us about the work of the Bosch Stiftung in political affairs.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me. Asking a foundation executive to speak about his work that he's passionate about is a very dangerous endeavor. I try to keep it to 5 to 7 minutes, but because Johanna was so kind and mentioned the Bosch Foundation several times as a positive example, I want to make transparent that I'm an alumnus of the Hertie School, and I'm very happy that Johanna's researching on those fields. She wasn't there when I was a student, otherwise I would have taken her class. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we are doing. So we strongly believe, as my predecessors have also said, that civil society voice has to be heard in political debates, has to be represented in order to have a lively and vibrant democracy. But the problem of civil society voices is often that they are not very well resourced to do political advocacy. Private foundations do have the financial, but also the political and social capital to support those voices that need to be heard in order to make democracy more inclusive and more representative, but don't have the means to do so. And Sarah mentioned the tension of neutrality of foundations and why we are so hesitant to do that. And what is important in our work is that we say we are non-partisan, but we are not neutral. And we are not neutral because we do have values that our work is based on. We are not neutral because we want to change society, because we do detect certain ills in society that we try to tackle. And that means we are inherently political. But we are not on one side of the political spectrum supporting one political party or doing political advocacy in the party politics sense. And that is important, to have values and principles, but to never be in one political camp in a way, or on one political party. So how do we actually work and do that? We do basically combine 3 streams of our work in one department in order to use synergies between it. One is that we are trying to promote the evidence base of policymaking. We believe that policy has to be more evidence-based, and we do that by supporting the supply side, if you will. So we're supporting think tanks as primary evidence producers with concrete policy action and advice as institutionally as we can. So we shifted largely to institutional funding to give them very much flexibility and agility to react spontaneously to changes in society. And we are specifically funding expertise that comes from the so-called global south or the global majority, or the former colonized. You pick a term that feels comfortable with you, but the voices that are underrepresented in global discussions, because we believe that if we continue to talk among us nice transatlantic white men in their 50s, we might not be able to tackle the challenges that we have to that are coming up in the 21st century, that are more global, more interconnected, and more multipolar. And so we are trying to support the voices from the so-called global south. On the supply side, if you will. We're doing it by funding, as I said. We're doing it by funding think tanks. We're doing it by funding networks like the Global South Initiative, the Southern Voice Initiative. Sorry, it's a think tank group from the Global South, but also support the sector itself. For example, the think tank lab that we're doing with Merix and the DGRP in Berlin, because we realize that The think tank sector in some countries is developed more than in others. And here I would say like Washington is far ahead from Berlin in a self-critical way on the quality of the think tank sector. On the quality of political philanthropy, I want to say it's the opposite. Often people use the US as a positive example, but the lack of political legitimacy that philanthropy has becomes very apparent when one looks at certain funding schemes in the US, where private money has a huge impact on politics without ever having been elected by anybody to do that. In a transparent way, like Sarah rightly said. So I think maybe the more conservative, cautious German approach is not always bad, although I think we should be more bold in being out there. But then on the demand side, so not the supply side, the demand side is the policymakers and the decision makers, and we try to strengthen them. We try to equip them with skills and knowledge to be able to actually tackle the challenges of the future. And we do it mainly in Germany, although also with some international networks, because in Germany, policymakers are recruited from a very local, in a very local way, to put it politely, that has certain advantages in terms of, rootedness in their constituency, but it has disadvantages in terms of their horizon and their kind of perspective on the world. And so we try to expose policymakers to international challenges by going, for example, to the Kennedy School in Harvard for an executive education seminar, to go to the Lee Kuan Yew School to get an Asian perspective, to take study trips to, for example, Ghana next year, and those type of things, to kind of give them a way to see how policy challenges are tackled elsewhere. But we also bring them together with peers of other countries. For example, we run a program where Indian, Australian, and German MPs come together to tackle challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. So we try to strengthen the capacity of decision makers. And then lastly, we work on advocacy, in which we try to amplify the voice of our colleagues in the foundation and the expertise that they gain from their work, to give them a way to get the expertise into the political discourse, and also, frankly, train our colleagues in the foundation, because working in the political space is not something that everybody is comfortable with. And lastly, we are building bridges between experts, decision makers, and opinion leaders in our Robert Bosch Academy, which is an institution in Berlin, where renowned international actors come together who work on policy issues, and they both enrich the policy debate in Berlin and Europe, but they also go back with a better understanding of how Germany and Europe work on political matters. And one thing I have to say to close is that we are very much trying to strengthen marginalized groups within Germany, because as Jeff and Sarah rightly said, we have a supposedly representative democracy, but if you look at the actual diversity that we have in our political chambers, it's a very unrepresentative of the German public. And so we are a proud partner of multitudes, among others, to kind of change that. Which, if I can just say in a side comment, is not always something that everybody applauds. I've just recently talked to an MP that I very much respect, and he's a great person to represent his constituency, and a very educated person. But he said, all these kind of new initiatives that bring all these outsiders into politics, I had to work very hard since I'm very young to get where I am, and they get in from the sidelines. And he understands that the parliament has to be more inclusive, but as comes with every kind of power sharing, power sharing often means some people have to give up power. And as a white man always said, we have had a couple of good centuries, and maybe now it's time to hand it over to others. And so that's what we are doing. We are still, as Sarah rightly said, in a minority of funders in Europe, and I'm mainly also here to advertise for this kind of approach to work with policymakers and get more people to join the cause and do it differently, experiment, do it better, so we can learn from them, because I think there's enough space for more funders to do those things.
Right, thanks very much, Henry. I mean, the point you made there about your sort of coming in from the sidelines just puts me in mind of something else, in that to a certain extent, because of the kind of political party machines, a lot of kind of local and national politicians, in a sense, sort of self-selecting, because they get into the machine early and they're sort of brought on and groomed. For those who aren't, the kind of voiceless, we've all been talking about, the ones who are kind of marginalized. How does philanthropy compensate for those who don't have that sort of background or that kind of education? I mean, what can it do? Because I mean, they've got this whole kind of, like, as I said, this whole kind of pipeline that feeds people into the main parties, and is philanthropy somehow going to be able to offset that?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, one thing before the parenthesis that is important, as someone who worked in Parliament for different MPs for many years, I don't want to be misunderstood as someone who thinks that this kind of rootedness in the constituency is per se something negative, because part of a democracy is that you go through this ladder and through this process, and you actually, us educated elites in our nice kind of offices, in our suits, we always think it should be experts on very substantive matters that go into politics, that are experts on, I don't know, international financing and stuff. That is nice, but you also need people who are able to speak to my mother, my father, and to go to the market square and communicate and to really understand what is needed on the ground. And so this rootedness is important. But for that reason, and now I'm answering a question, for that reason, it is also important to get voices into Parliament that do have this perspective from a different angle, who are, who maybe did not go to university, who maybe were not born in the country, who maybe belong to other kind of marginalized groups. And they don't participate in political processes because they feel it's not for them, because they watch the news and nobody looks like them and nobody speaks like them. They do not join because they don't know how. It's very simple. Like where do I call? And they just need sometimes, and it's not meant to be sounding patronizing or paternalistic, but just skill training. Like speaking publicly is no rocket science. Being able to understand policy implications of a certain law is no rocket science. One can learn those things, and it's a matter of just being encouraged. And that is, I think, what you're speaking to someone who's the first in his family to went to university. Just a couple of people who in your upbringing as a child come to you and say you can do that too is all you need. And then you have to fend for yourself, and you have to compete on the political market space like anybody else. That's going to stay like that, and that's a good thing. Germany is becoming much more diverse than most Germans realize, and it's time that we see that in politics.
Great. Yeah, I was kind of thinking about those kind of concrete steps that you've been talking about there. That's kind of important. So, unless anybody wants to jump in straight on that, I'm going to move to the first question of the Q&A. That's coming from Taib Hafsi. Could you discuss the legitimacy of influencing the political system through philanthropy, knowing that can't actually read this now. System through philanthropy, knowing that inevitably money becomes the key factor in politics, leaving large population groups out in the cold. Johanna, anything to say about that? The question on the question.
I'm trying to read the question as well here. Yeah, I think it's basically going back to the discussion that you also started with Sarah in terms of the legitimacy of philanthropy to intervene in the democratic system and political systems in general. So the point that I was trying to make, to move also to use this as an opportunity to think about the role of philanthropy and the self-identity of philanthropy as a player who cares about creating healthy context, implies that you don't actively pursue particular agendas. That is very much in line what actually Henry was talking about. Foundations not being afraid of being political, because political doesn't mean to take a particular party position. It means can also be non-partisan, but it also means that we have to stop pretending that there is philanthropy is neutral, right? I'm not going to open to the whole discussion in terms of is philanthropy democratic in the first place? That's my colleague Rob Rees from Stanford PAX have been writing about this, and that will be basically exploding the session today. But I think what we have to do is to normalize the fact that we need more political work supported by philanthropies without them actually steering in which direction this goes. And this is why I am so welcome, and that's why I spend 20 hours a week doing field work in this space of political innovation, because we are building a set of actors, innovators, orchestrators that are able to actually absorb philanthropic capital and then serve as those who basically can guard and engage in the political work. I do not want foundations all of a sudden to have political agendas, and just because they are more resourceful dominate political agenda. That would not be consistent with philanthropy as the actually meaning love for humanity.
Yeah, so it's about supporting the practice of politics rather than about sort of taking political positions, yeah?
Actually, we have to, if we care about democracy, we have to understand that it's a living concept, you know. It's not something that is put in stone. We have to constantly strengthen it as a muscle, right? It has to be a living one. And that means that we also have to rethink practices. We have to put our eyes on the aspects that do not work. And this is why I so appreciate also the focus on inclusion that Multitudes Foundation has. No, but this is an ongoing effort. And I think philanthropies, and you know, we cannot just talk, foundations are also different, but philanthropies themselves, they have a really critical role here. But I don't think that the role is to interfere with political agendas.
Great. Jeff, Sarah, anything to add to that?
Well, just because Johanna just mentioned how important it is to focus on political inclusion, I just wanted to make the point that, and this also goes to the question about philanthropy's influence on policy and an agenda. I want to make the point that in order for us to be inclusive, this also goes hand in hand with overcoming structural barriers to representation. There are structural issues at place, and this is the reason why we see a lack of representation from underrepresented communities. So, for example, very exclusionary structures in political parties, for example, that need to change the way that they actually welcome and the way actually decide on the political list, for example, on the election list, for example, in order to have other people coming in from other communities that are maybe not as included in some of the networks, the informal networks that are necessary in order to win this, like Henry put it, marketplace of politics, that are facing also also facing harassment, for example, that is coming because they are very targeted, because they're very visible as people from underrepresented communities. So there are a slew of reasons why we don't have representation in the way that we want to have it. And we need to, I think, find structural solutions for these structural issues as well. And if we do that, if politics is more inclusive, this also goes, and this is something that I mentioned at the beginning, it also goes to the culture of politics, how we go about politics, how people that are outside of politics connect to power. There are so many self-organizations out there. There are so many communities that are actually already doing empowerment work for their communities that could be very well equipped to work together with the political landscape to address issues of their communities, to create also policies that are very well versed to address these issues. So if we change the way that politics work, and if we change political culture to make it more inclusive, this should also then prevent undue influence of certain groups that are not necessarily working towards the greater good.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me move on to this next question from Deirdre Mortel. Dublin experienced riots and looting last Thursday night that terrified migrants and shut down the city. How can or should philanthropy address the rise of the far right? Sarah, can I pass that particular hot potato to you first? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I want to thank you, Deirdre, for bringing that question. Also, this is something we're seeing happening all across Europe, and I can say all across the globe, because I see there are people from everywhere here in the chat. I think it's really what philanthropy needs to address, is that those rioting and this looting is happening because of a political debate that is extremely abrasive, that is extremely exclusive, and that is extremely violent. And so I think both we want to promote a political space that is not encouraging violence, but also a political discourse that is rooted in the idea of coexistence and the ability for people to be respected and live dignified lives. So I think the way philanthropy can address that is actually by supporting the actors of this political change. And I feel like we're repeating the same thing, but Jeff and I are working on the same project. But I think the way philanthropy can address that is by supporting those groups who are promoting an inclusive political culture and inclusive politics to be equipped. What we know now, and there's actually, I feel like I'm doing the advertising for the issue, but it's really going to be interesting. So I really encourage you to look at it. But there's an article that, is going to be, you can read it the next issue, by Alice Barb, who talks a little bit about the amount of funding that gets into, the kind of extreme right polarizing work that's happening all across Europe. So we need to, I don't like to say we should just respond to that, but in some way, philanthropy should respond to the fact that there's very, very large amounts of funding, like we're talking about multiple millions that are invested in this kind of abrasive politics, exclusionary politics, and that end up with this violence. So I think we need to rebalance, but also we need to think about how we make politics differently. That's why the focus we have at Multitude is based on these values of politics needs to be a place where it is human and it is hopeful, because I think that's also what politics needs, is a little bit more care. And so we also really focus not only on the initiatives that create more inclusion, but that do so with the idea of politics being a place for everyone to thrive and feel welcomed. So I know it's a very large answer for a very large question, but I agree that this is something we need to address as philanthropists.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, Andrew, if I might, because
Certainly, yes.
So another the Dublin case, because I don't know enough about it, but we have these discussions in Germany now. Should philanthropy do something against the rise of the right-wing populist party? We have important elections coming up next year, and there are some of them in which the AfD is the strongest party. And my answer is always, let's not do something against one specific party, speaking about not being partisan, not being party political, but let's do something to strengthen the resilience of our democracy. And that has something to do with institutions, like media, like legal institutions, like courts. And it has something to do with democratic culture in a country. Because those, the people that in polls or elections are supporting certain parties that we here in this room might not agree with, they have to be reached, they have to be talked to, they have to be included, because they do that very often because they feel that they're excluded. And as a philanthropic actor that is outside of the party political game, our role could be to bring actors together that normally wouldn't talk to each other, to give people voices that wouldn't get voices. And that I believe is strengthening democracy, and that might hopefully also decrease the populist parts of the spectrum. But it's not a quick fix, and it's not something that just happens from one day to the other. And then whenever an election comes up, people are saying, we have to do something right now because in 3 months is elections. Like, that's not how it works, because voters are not stupid. If you come to talk to them only to tell them before the elections that they shouldn't vote a certain way, I would just out of spite vote exactly that way, because I would feel treated like a child.
Right. So in a sense, it's a kind of whole cycle, isn't it? You need to sort of revive institutions. You need to revive institutions by turning people back onto them, making them feel that they're sort of relevant. So it's a question, where do we start the process? Does it start with kind of Jeff and Sarah's work in organizations like that, sort of bringing different voices into politics? Is that the starting point?
I'm afraid, Andrew, we have to think in different ways about this. So I'm with Henry that this is really the backbone work that foundations need to do, and they do a great job. And they are in Germany the first ones to also say deliberately embrace political as the way we discussed it. And yet I think there is a sense of urgency where I think we will need to do something. So Deidre, great to hear you from you or read from you. Great to connect again. So, and the same as in Ireland, in Germany, there will be a sense of urgency next year. And I'm afraid we will not be able to just follow the path that you described, Henry. I think there needs to be a parallel effort. I'm not saying that should be done by foundations like you. It could be much more citizen mobilizing, but there needs to be something that we need to do in terms of preventing something that we have seen coming and we haven't done anything. And that goes back to the point of political innovation is something that needs to be attentive to the pathology of the political system in each geography and each context. I follow here the chat, and there are wonderful examples that bring us to Africa and showcase how there it is often about mobilizing voters to actually go to the election. For a long time in the US, the way we diagnosed pathologies was that everything is centered around these elections and all the philanthropic money just goes into the elections. I'm afraid we are now in Europe, and it's really something that I realized last week, where we also, and I often said in Europe it's different, we have different pathologies such as who goes into becoming a politician, but in Europe we will also have to deal with these punctuated events of elections and start mobilizing people, energy, love and money around those.
Okay, great. Well, we're getting towards the far end of this, unfortunately. So what I want to do is to circle back to all the panelists and ask them for sort of a kind of a last reflection. Any kind of takeaways from this discussion? What's any salient things that stand out for you about the whole issue of philanthropy and politics? Jeff, can I move to you first, if that's okay?
Yes, of course. I think what stood out for me, but this is also something that must be very clear. This is a joint effort, and when we speak about joint effort, this is about civil society, politics. It's as much as it is about science, economy, and so on and so forth. So there is really this urgency for people who want to see democracies thrive and who want to see democracies survive also, to come together and see how we can actually affect this change that is necessary so that democracies can respond to what is happening right now. This goes for so many of the issues that we're having, but really this idea of making democracy resilient is really based on a democratic culture, as Henry also put it. So for us to get to the point where we have this democratic culture, it is now time, especially also for philanthropy, to assume the responsibility that comes with it. Even though this might not be a new point in that sense, but I just want to make sure that this is emphasized and that we get out of this interesting conversation with the notion of this is something that we need to do, but also something that is very much feasible. We have plans, we have strategies to get there. The change makers out there have the strategies to get there. It's just a matter of actually doing this work and supporting this work. So let's get on with it.
Thanks, Jeff. Henry, over to you.
I don't want to repeat anything we have said. We have said so many interesting things. One thing we haven't touched, and I want to add that, is what Johanna just mentioned in a half sentence. Democracy is changing. What the Greeks invented 2,000 years ago. Where land-owning men made all the decisions. It's not what we live in today, and democracy has different shapes in France and Germany and the US, different countries. And I think one answer to the challenges that we have discussed about, increasing democratic participation and sense of representation is to maybe think about how our democracy can change. And we are very often stuck, we elites, and all of us on this call are elites, by the way, what we have learned how democracy is supposed to work. And maybe we have to think about new ways of participating citizens, of digital democracy, citizen assemblies, going more out into, outside of our capitals and our nice little, bourgeois neighborhoods where we walk our dog, and kind of get to the people that don't feel represented by us. And be open to experiment with new forms of democratic participation.
Great. Thank you, Henry. Timely reminder. Johanna, could I ask you for a last thought?
Yeah, so I think Jeff and Henry already alluded to it, and perhaps if I can put my own tag on what they said, for me, the conversation today, but also what I see every day in our work on the field is this immense opportunity that here we have the opportunity to reconnect also civil society, politics, and philanthropy in a new way. And it's time that we do that, because it's going to be a new way, because it will be at eye level, and I'm super excited to be part of that and also contribute as a learning partner.
Great, thank you, Johanna. Sarah, you have the last word.
Thank you very much, and it will be, also following Johanna's comment. I think many people commented in the chat, there's already tons of money in politics. It is true, but it is not used in a way that is serving, like politics that works for everyone. I just want to say a word about how we fund, because this is something very important for us as well. It's not about a very top-down, last-minute approach, as Henry mentioned. It's about getting people who are actually affected by underrepresentation to decide how they're going to do that. So having really a bottom-up approach in philanthropy, a trust-based approach, is not only the amount, it's also the way we are funding that's going to make a huge difference.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. It's with me to sort of close down the proceedings now. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. I certainly have. Don't forget that Alliance is running a joint subscription offer with Nonprofit Quarterly, and you could save $49 if you subscribe to both before the 30th of November. So do click the link in the chat if you're interested in that. Again, thanks very much to our expert panelists, to Mercer for sponsoring today's events, to the Alliance team, and particularly Emma McGoldrick for producing the event, and most of all for all of you for taking part and listening. Our last event of the year is a live stream called 2023, A Year in Philanthropy, where our panel will be discussing philanthropy's AI journey and how far there's left to go with EDI. So again, if you're interested in that, do click on the link in the chat. Thanks again to all, and goodbye.